Hello music fans, this is Peter Sco from Music as a Journey, and we are going to take a look at another first 10 albums of a particular band and part of the series that I'm doing this year. August 4th, 1967, that was 56 years ago, this album here was released. Pink Floyd's debut album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And I'm a couple of days slightly late here. To be honest with you, I already did record a video of this, but I talked so much about the band's history that after the first 6 albums, it was already 50 minutes long. So I'm going to try to condense it here and make it a little bit more bearable for the viewers out there. So let's take a look at the history of Pink Floyd based on their beginnings and what went on during the recording of their first 10 albums. So our story starts off back in 1962 when architectural students Roger Waters and Nick Mason met up and decided they would form a band together. Nick Mason being a drummer and Roger Waters at the time was a guitar player. So they formed a band with 4 other fellows and named the band Sigma 6. Now from 1962 to 1965, Sigma 6 went through a number of lineup changes and also a number of name changes. Along the way, they acquired Richard Wright on keyboards and Syd Barrett on rhythm guitar. However, when their lead guitarist left, Syd Barrett took over on lead, and when their vocalist left, Syd Barrett also took over the vocals, until finally they were a 4-piece band. During this shuffling of the lineup, the name also changed from Sigma 6 to the Megadeths, the Abdabs, the Screaming Abdabs, and a couple of other names before they finally settled on the name The Tea-Set. And the Tea-Set is what they became and were for a while, playing mostly rhythm and blues covers. However, at one time, just before a gig, sometime in early 1965, they discovered there was another band on the bill that was named The Tea-Set. And so on the spur of the moment, they thought of a name change, and Syd Barrett thought of 2 of his favorite blues guitarists, Pink Anderson and Floyd Council, and so they named the band the Pink Floyd Sound. The Pink Floyd Sound would eventually be shortened to just the Pink Floyd, and finally, Pink Floyd. However, during the 1960s, even as they were known as Pink Floyd, sometimes they were still billed as the Pink Floyd or credited as the Pink Floyd. Anyway, they continued on doing their blues covers, but they started to experiment a little bit more, and once they got gigs, regular gigs at a place called the UFO Club, they started really experimenting. They were part of the London underground scene, and so they would start off with a song and then do some kind of extended instrumental experimental break before wrapping up the song again. Now during this time, they got the attention of some folks who put together a management company and started promoting the band, trying to get them a recording. They did actually cut a demo, which was then picked up by EMI, and the band were signed to EMI in early 1967. They released a single called Arnold Lane, which was a very interesting song about a man who steals women's clothing from washing lines and takes them home and puts those clothes on. The song actually, because of its subject matter, was banned from a number of radio stations, but it did quite well. So the band went into the studio in the early part of 1967 to begin working on the album. Norman Smith, who was the engineer for the Beatles albums, was actually appointed as producer of the first Pink Floyd album. And they started recording at what would become Abbey Road Studios, Abbey Road Studios. And at the same time, the Beatles were actually working on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in the same time there. And I remember hearing in an interview with, I think it was Richard Wright, who said that they would sometimes poke their heads in to see what the Beatles were up to kind of help give them some ideas what to do in the studio. They had a lot of great ideas for live performances, and the question was how could they translate that into studio recordings, while at the same time Norman Smith was trying to get them to cut singles, because at this point, before Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was released, there was still a largely singles market and not album-oriented market. So they were still looking for those short 2.5, 3-minute songs with some catchy hook or catchy melody that could get them on the charts. Well, of course, then they cut and released the album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, released in, as I said, August 4th, 1967. The album is quite an interesting one. It includes Astronomy Domine, which is a very fascinating spacey type song, which of course was covered by Voivod some 22 years later. And I think Voivod's cover is actually very well done, and in a way it kind of suggests the timelessness of the song Astronomy Domine. Like, it was cut in 1967, but it sounds just as relevant in 1989, and even today it still is a brilliant piece of music, I think. We've also got Lucifer Sam on here, which first of all is a pretty cool track, but also features Roger Waters playing a bowed bass, which is kind of an interesting thing. There are a number of tracks on here that have more childlike lyrics, as Syd Barrett was writing songs inspired by various books from his childhood or stories that his mother told him. We've got a song about a gnome. We've got a song about a scarecrow that comes to life. We've got also Flaming, which has the lyrics like, yippee, you can't see me, but I can you. Like, very childlike lyrics, but also some very interesting music. The song Take Up Thy Stethoscope and Walk is also an interesting piece. And some interesting vocalizations. For example, on the one, what is it, Pow R Talk H. I don't know how you're supposed to read it, but they have that really weird doing 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 at the beginning. And I always thought that was kind of weird, you know, if I was playing that. If my mom decided to bring in some laundry into my bedroom at that time, she would probably wonder, what the heck are you listening to with this doing doing? But yeah, there's a kind of a lot of strange stuff on here that honestly is not exactly totally cool to be listening to, you know, in the latter half of the 80s, 87, 88, which is the time I got into Pink Floyd. But there's also a lot of really cool stuff on here. And of course, one of the big highlights is Interstellar Overdrive, which exactly shows what the band was doing live, with a very experimental piece with an extended instrumental part of them doing all sorts of crazy stuff. So along with this, they soon followed up with another single, See Emily Play, which did very well. However, as we all know, around this time, as Pink Floyd were starting to appear on top of the pops, they were starting to gain popularity outside of the underground, and it didn't go so well for Syd Barrett, actually. He had a lot of difficulties with it. Also, he had started using LSD more, and it's still questioned by some. What happened? Was it a result of the LSD? Was it a result of his disillusionment with what was happening in the pop scene with Pink Floyd? Or was it a combination of both? But Syd started becoming more erratic and unpredictable. There were times where he would just kind of stand around on stage with his back to the audience, sometimes playing only a single note. There were times like when they went to the US and they started to appear on US music programs, for example, American Bandstand or the Pat Boone Show. Syd just didn't really seem into the music, and they were performing to playback, but there's a famous instance where on the Pat Boone Show, every time the camera focused on Syd would just stare back at it blankly, even though the lyrics were clearly being sung by the lead singer. The lead singer was not actually moving his lips in sync with the lyrics. One interesting instance with Syd Barrett was when he failed to show up for a gig and they went to the hotel room and just found him spaced out in the hotel room, and Roger Waters, along with the manager and an assistant, the three of them gathered him together and, you know, basically hauled him off to try to get him to perform on stage. And the interesting thing is that is actually referenced in the movie The Wall, where Pink is spaced out in his hotel room, and his, you know, manager and some other people come rushing in and pick him up to get him off to the show, you know. So a lot of incidents that happened with Syd and the relationship with Syd, actually these things get mentioned again and again throughout the band's next 10 to 12 years of their history. I failed to mention that Syd Barrett was also a very close friend, childhood friend of Roger Waters, so it makes sense that Roger Waters, being kind of the creative force behind the band later on and also the principal songwriter later on, that there would be so much referencing and tributes to Syd Barrett. But anyway, with Syd's behavior becoming very erratic, they started work on the new album, but he couldn't be relied upon when it came to performing live. And so at one point, actually, a friend of Syd's from Cambridge came by to see what was going on, see what his friend was up to, and that was David Gilmour, who was quite surprised to see what kind of state Syd was in when he met him, because previously Syd Barrett had been a very cheerful and a kind of bouncy guy with lots of really great ideas and enthusiasm for music, enthusiasm for art. He was, a painting student, art student before, and David couldn't believe what had happened. But, as it was, Pink Floyd and the rest of the members then asked David Gilmour if he could fill in for Syd. So when Syd was on stage not really doing anything, maybe David could take over and play those parts. And that is basically how David Gilmour became part of the band. And for a brief 2 weeks, there was actually a 5-piece band, including the 2 guitarists on stage. However, difficulties continued. Syd, they decided to keep him on just as a songwriter. If he could turn out some more singles for the band, that would be great. He came up with one called Apples and Oranges, which they actually performed on the American Bandstand show, but the song really didn't do so well for them. And one of his final, he had a couple of final ones. One was called Vegetable Man, which the band was really not thrilled about, and in the end Roger Waters decided they didn't want it on the next album. But you can find it out there, and I actually listened to it for the first time on YouTube the other day, and I was really impressed with it, because Vegetable Man sounds like it includes 70s glam rock, 70s punk rock, 80s or 90s indie rock. It is a song that is just way ahead of its time in many respects. But Syd continued to be difficult with a song that he called Have You Got It Yet? And he basically showed the band how they should play it. And then once they learned it and tried to play it back, he would say, no, that's not it. And he would change it and keep doing this so that the song was actually never achieved. So, have you got it yet? No, because you keep changing it. So at one point, they finally just decided, they had a meeting and they just decided, Syd, you're not being of any help to us, and he's out of the band, which he kind of accepted anyway. So a couple of the people who were part of that management company, they opted to leave with Syd because they felt no Syd Barrett, no Pink Floyd. But one person remained and continued to plug in with the band. And so they finally put together their second album, A Saucerful of Secrets, in 1968. This is an interesting album in many respects. Piper of the Gates of Dawn was all Syd Barrett lead vocals, all written by Syd Barrett, and basically all the songs were based on Syd Barrett's writings. Whereas here, Jug Band Blues, the final track, is the only one that was actually written by Syd Barrett and featuring him on vocals. And there's some interesting line at the beginning that says, "It's awfully considerate of you to think of me here, and I'm much obliged to you for making it clear that I'm not here," which shows how he was kind of feeling being in the band in his final days in the band, where he basically felt like, yeah, he was welcome to be there, but, they basically just worked around him. Another track on here, Remember a Day, that actually is the only track to feature all 5 members. Syd playing some of these high-tone slide guitar bits, and David Gilmour playing a bit of guitar in there as well. The rest of the album is quite interesting because the person whose vocals feature the most is actually Richard Wright. Rick Wright is on 5, doing vocals on 5 of these 7 tracks. Including Saucerful of Secrets, which has Rick and David doing non-lyrical vocals. We have that very interesting Let There Be More Light with Roger Waters and, I think it's Roger Waters and Rick Wright singing on that one. Has that very interesting opening bass line and goes into a kind of smoother bit with some very dramatic chorus parts. Sorry, it's not Roger Waters, is it? It's a Roger Waters song, but it's David Gilmour singing, I think. Remember a Day is, of course, a Rick Wright song with the piano in there. And Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun is a Roger Waters song, very slow, moody, again, this kind of space rock, early space rock type thing. And Corporal Clegg actually features some lead vocals by Nick Mason, which is a very rare thing. And also one of the first Pink Floyd songs to mention about the war, Corporal Clegg. And also some pretty kind of edgy, little bit gritty, hard guitar in there as well. Saucerful of Secrets being, what Pink Floyd were doing live with this kind of extended instrumental, experimental type track. Seesaw, another Rick Wright, Music One, and then of course Jug Band Blues. So a very interesting album, one that I actually always liked. It was one of the first Pink Floyd albums I got after getting the classic ones, you know, from the 70s. I think this was my first dip back into the past before Dark Side of the Moon. So I've always kind of had a soft spot for this one. So now with Syd Barrett officially out of the band, they continue, and one of the things was that they started doing soundtracks. They did some tracks for a movie called The Committee, and then a certain Barbette Schroeder, who was doing a movie called More, about a tourist visiting the island of Ibiza in the Mediterranean and kind of getting into the whole psychedelic drug culture scene that was going on there at the time. Cat wants out, just a moment. So Pink Floyd thought actually maybe doing soundtracks would be a good thing for them in case, you know, being part of the regular touring schedule wasn't working out and they were having a hard time with singles. So maybe also writing soundtracks would be cool. So they accepted the idea. They were given a kind of rough version of the movie so that they could watch it and kind of time the sequences that their music would be needed, because this time they had to basically cut their tracks to fit certain time points in the movie, and some of the tracks were kind of left open-ended so that, you know, scenes could be faded out as needed. So the resulting album was the soundtrack for the movie More, and this is quite an interesting thing here. We've got some of the experimental spacey type pieces like Cirrus Minor, Quicksilver featuring some weird like effects using tape being pulled around and sped up and slowed down. We also have some pretty cool of these more pastoral mellow type songs like Green is the Color, Cymbeline, Crying Song. Some of these more kind of incidental music type tracks like Up the Khyber. Spanish piece is rather interesting as it features Spanish guitar and then a person with a lisp speaking. Listen, gringo, if you make fun of my lisp, I kill you, I think. Something like this. It's rather humorous. I've never seen the movie, so I'm not sure how all this fits in, but some of the highlights for me actually are, of course, the Nile song, which I've never really read any explanation of how that song came to be, but, you know, Paul McCartney wrote Helter Skelter as a kind of response to The Who, I Can See for Miles, but the Nile song clearly blows Helter Skelter right out of the water, and of course also later on covered by Voivod as well as some other bands. The Pink Floyd version is just sheer bombast, and it sounds barely contained, especially during some of the shouts and screams at the end. They're just, you know, going off at the top of their lungs. Nick Mason is hitting some pretty thumping bass drum parts in parts of it. It's just such an incredible song. For someone like me who really loves heavy proto-metal stuff from the 60s, this is like, you know, top-notch material. And then of course we have the Ibiza Bar, which is also a heavy track, but a little bit more restrained and held back, but still like a wonderful counterpart to the Nile song. So that is More, Pink Floyd's third album and a soundtrack. Now they would also do another soundtrack in 1969. They contributed some material for the Zabriskie Point movie, along with Grateful Dead, where the two, Pink Floyd and the Grateful Dead, Jerry Garcia were basically the two main groups behind the music here. Interesting thing, in 1968 they released a track called Careful with That Axe Eugene, a very kind of, again, eerie type, powerful piece with some, you know, lighter sections, a bit weird with Roger Waters doing that, you know, careful, careful, that axe, Eugene, Gene. Like a horror movie type echoing effect that would become popular later on in the 70s for horror movies, but also that fantastic powerful part with Roger Waters doing that inhaled scream. And for this movie here, they actually kind of did a redo of that Careful with That Axe Eugene in a track called Come In Number 51, Your Time Is Up. So this album here actually holds, I think, 8 tracks provided by the Pink Floyd. But that is actually not an official Pink Floyd album, whereas More is. Of course, later on in 69, gosh, they're busy, aren't they? Later on in 69, they went ahead with the double album Ummagumma, which was 1-disc live material and 1-disc studio material. The term, or the nonsense word Ummagumma, being a roadie's slang expression for some sex. So I'm going to go home and get some Ummagumma. Anyway, that one there was an interesting take because they decided that for the studio disc, each band member would get one half of a side. So Roger Waters came up with Grantchester Meadows, a very pastoral piece with acoustic guitar and bird and insect sounds, as well as the lengthily titled Several Species of Small Furry Animals Gathered Together in a Cave and Grooving with a Pict, which was a whole bunch of sound effects, sped up vocals, backwards vocals, percussion, as well as somebody reading in a very heavily Pictish accent, and the wind cried merry. Interesting track. David Gilmour came up with The Narrow Way, and apparently he was at first very thrilled about the idea of coming up with a whole like quarter of an album composition of his own, but he later on felt it was actually much more challenging. He asked Roger Waters to write some lyrics. Roger refused, and he ended up coming up with What We Got, which he later on said that he just bullshitted his way through. Nick Mason came up with his Grand Vizier's Garden Party, featuring, quite a lengthy 7-minute drum solo bit with I think some woodwind by his then wife. And Rick Wright came up with his piece, Sisyphus, featuring mellotron and organs and all sorts of things there. The album actually is one that I've never gotten on CD, even though I keep thinking I should. It is the only Pink Floyd album I don't have on CD of their regular albums, but I did have it on cassette back in the 80s, so I do remember it being kind of interesting, but a little weird to listen to, especially the Garden Party thing and the Sisyphus. I remember not really being able to get into those so very well, but the album still got a fair bit of praise from a lot of people for it being so interesting, and one YouTuber I saw even said it is his favorite Pink Floyd album. So moving on into 1970, we find the band is starting to enter a period of where they're not really sure what they want to do. And for the next album, they didn't really have any particular idea. They had a kind of piece that was coming together, and they recorded basically a backing track for it, and then went off on tour in the US and kind of left it with, I think it was their engineer, Ron Geeson, and kind of told him, well, see what you can do to finish it up. So Ron decided, okay, well, we've got this thing here that sounds like a soundtrack for an epic film, so let's get in a brass band, let's get in a choir and a cello, and let's work with it. But it was such a mess to work with that Ron Geeson actually had to ask the choir director to kind of help direct and put the whole thing together. So, this whole thing with this soundtrack for an epic film that never existed came out as the Adam Hart Mother Suite on side 1 of this album, I think coming up to close to 22 minutes long. Which, the band later on looked back on as a kind of an experiment that didn't really go very well, especially David Gilmour and Roger Waters are not so fond of it. But I actually find it's quite interesting. In some of the parts, like the choir singing without any actual lyrics, any words, just making all these different kind of vocalizations, or even like the main theme in the music with the brass band playing, it's got a lot of really cool stuff to it, and for a guy who was into all sorts of like hair metal and traditional metal and thrash metal and so on in the 80s, this was really something different to listen to. But I always felt that brass band part kind of connected me a bit with my dad, because he was into this, kind of like classical or marching band or jazz or James Last type of thing. So I kind of felt some connection with him there. Side 2 is, of course, everybody doing something. Roger Waters doing the song If, very gentle acoustic guitar piece. David Gilmour, Fat Old Son, a song he actually kind of struggled to throw together, but then he felt very proud of it later on. And Rick Wright doing Summer 68, which is actually, interestingly, one of my favorite Pink Floyd songs. I just really love this upbeat piano type song with this trumpet solo and later on the full-on brass band, again making me feel I had a kind of connection with my dad's music. And an interesting thing, a viewpoint lyrically about an experience with a groupie. And kind of pondering that, that this is what we do, and the kind of human feeling behind it, that now we've spent that time together and now we're going to be separated. And are we even going to think about it, remember each other later on? And then finally wrapping up with Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast in 3 parts with some lovely piano and acoustic guitar and all these sound effects of roadie Alan Stiles eating breakfast and chatting. I think it was in Nick Mason's kitchen. Sounds of cereal and toast and tea and all that kind of thing. The album actually got them a #1 spot in Britain and number 22 in the United States. So in spite of the band's misgivings about the album, it actually did very well and showed that a band composing this type of music could actually get recognized in the charts. So they move on then to 1971, and again, what are we going to do? So there's some ideas of like, why don't we try to make some compositions using household objects? So they spent days trying to get a rubber band strung over some pencils to sound like a bass guitar. Nick Mason spent a lot of time trying to get certain drum sounds from pots and pans. Various experiments were conducted, and after a few days, I think it was Rick Wright said, "This is just crazy. Like, why are we spending so much time trying to make household objects sound like the instruments that we already have?" So they kind of gave up on that, and then they had an idea for something called Nothings, which became The Son of Nothings, and finally Return of the Son of Nothings, and finally the piece evolved into the track Echoes, which is recognized as one of Pink Floyd's greater achievements in their early catalog. Here from the album Meddle, released back in 1971, side 2 being 23-minute long track of Echoes, and it's really interesting when you think about the other side-long epics of the day, like what Genesis or Rush or Caravan or King Crimson or, you know, Vandergraaf Generator, what they were doing. They were all very busy tracks with lots of stuff happening, whereas Echoes just slowly builds into one theme. That theme gradually fades as it's replaced by another theme, and then that theme fades to be replaced by another theme. It's all very slowly moving from piece to piece. So it is really something different, and I think it's quite an achievement. Side 1 features also a collection of some pretty cool tracks, like One of These Days, David Gilmour and Roger Waters both playing bass on a kind of, you know, echo effect for that kind of double bass echo effect. And the interesting line, Nick Mason saying, "One of these days I'm going to cut you into little pieces," which apparently he spoke in falsetto, which was recorded at double speed and then played back at regular speed. You know, the things that Pink Floyd were doing in the studio, they were using the studio as a paint box. Like, this is the place where they created their art with all sorts of experimentation with different types of effects and instruments. And, you know, even Rick Wright, he always kind of welcomed any kind of new type of a synthesizer or anything that he could play around with to work on different effects. And that would play out more in the albums to come after this. We also have, what the heck is it called? Pillow of Winds, a very lovely piece sung by David Gilmour. Fearless, which I always thought was a really kind of cool, kind of powerful, slow but powerful piece with the footballers chanting at the end. Saint-Tropez, Roger Waters singing a very kind of easy, laid-back, almost lounge piece with some nice piano soloing by Rick. And Seamus, a weird song where David Gilmour was babysitting Steve Marriott's dog, and the dog kept howling while he was playing stuff on the guitar, and they turned it into a track which is not exactly one of their most popular ones. The cover artwork, of course, Hypnosis had been doing the albums right from Saucerful of Secrets and onwards, and this here, apparently Storm Thurgeson wanted to do a baboon's anus for the cover, but the band, who were in Japan at the time, told him over the phone, "No, we want an ear underwater." And so what we get here is a very close-up photo of an ear with water ripples, so it kind of looks like sound waves are entering the ear. But recently I watched a video on Chris Prophy's Musically Obsessed channel, and he was talking about hidden messages behind albums, and apparently the hidden message here is that Syd Barrett is listening. And it's true, actually, that there were occasions where he might show up around the studios, kind of just hang about a bit and leave again. So it was kind of like he was checking up on what his band was up to. So maybe this album cover kind of reflects that. So the album actually was doing really well in Europe, but it was not very well promoted in the US and didn't really sell as much as they had hoped. So already in 1972, early 72, they had begun testing new material for a new album. But along the way, the old director there, Barbet Schroeder, contacted the band again and said, I've got another movie coming out called La Vallée, and I would like you guys to do the soundtrack. So once again, the band was given a kind of rough working copy of the film so they could time out the pieces. And the resulting album was this one here, which was originally supposed to be titled La Vallée, soundtrack to the movie La Vallée. But during some falling out with the movie production unit, they ended up just calling it Obscured by Clouds. And the actual cover photo here is a scene, a still from the movie, when they were viewing the slides. Storm Thurgeson and company were viewing the slide jammed in the projector and they got this weird out of focus effect, and they decided that's the effect they would use for the cover. Now this album is actually a really interesting Pink Floyd album, because if you consider Atom Heart Mother and Meddle, where they both have a sidelong epic track, and then the other side is mostly very gentle pieces actually, what you get here is basically a 70s rock album. If you had never heard of Pink Floyd, maybe you might have heard Money on the radio, but you didn't know it was Pink Floyd, or you might have heard Wish You Were Here, but you didn't really know that it was Pink Floyd, and you decided, okay, I hear Pink Floyd is a great band, I'm going to go out and pick up an album and see what they're like, and you happen to find Obscured by Clouds was, discounted or something, and you okay, I'm going to get this one just to check it out, why spend a lot of money on a new band? If you were to hear this without knowing anything else, you would think this is another 1970s rock band. It starts with this two-part instrumental, a little bit on the heavy side, a little bit on the rockin' side, and it's got this what is it? We've got the lovely track here, Burning Bridges. We've got a track where it's Rick Wright and David Gilmour both singing together in harmony, which is really beautiful. The Golds in the is just a straight up hard rockin' track, really cool hard rock song. What's the Deal, a David Gilmour sung song, and then we've got Mudmen also, which is a really cool song. Childhood's End, which is actually a David Gilmour penned song, also really groovy and rocking song. Free For, which was the single, which is Roger Waters singing the lead on that one, and basically once again referencing war veterans. You shuffle in the gloom of the sick room and talk to yourself as you die. It's an upbeat song with rather depressing lyrics. And we finally come around to Stay, which is Rick Wright doing one of his soft ones with his kind of very soft, little bit lower vocals, which contrast with David Gilmour's soft, higher vocals. And then finally, absolutely Curtains, which is a typical, keyboard effect with some percussion, spacey, atmospheric type piece, which then concludes with some children and some, I guess, like an old religious leader or group leader chanting, which is actually from a scene in the movie. So quite an interesting album. If you did not know anything else from Pink Floyd, this is a pretty cool early 70s rock band album. But of course then they get back to work on the album that they were really seriously working on, and there is just so much to say about this album here. There are documentaries about just this album. I'm going to just mention a few things that are probably kind of interesting. For example, Alan Parsons, the engineer, got the idea to record all these clocks going off, which later on they decided to put on the album. Alan Parsons also got in Claire Torrey to do the vocals for The Great Gig in the Sky, and apparently, similar to the other two albums, the band didn't really know what they wanted. They just knew that they wanted a female vocalist to come in and sing over the music. They didn't want lyrics, and so she just kind of let loose and actually felt a little bit embarrassed about, maybe overdoing it, but the band, without really saying so, approved of it, and finally, she ended up on the track there, and she didn't even know about it. She was just paid a session fee and not told anything until the album was released, and she happened to check the credits and found that she was credited on there. Kind of weird how things like that happen. But anyway, of course, this is, one of the pillar albums of rock, as some people have said. I remember reading in the 80s that there are people who don't even like rock music who have a copy of this album. It went to #1 for 1 week, but it ended up staying on the charts, I think, for over 900 weeks. It went, continued on till 1988, being in the album charts there. So, selling 45 million copies or something like that. The fourth biggest selling album of all time. Pretty amazing. I don't know what else there's really to say about it. There's just so much. Syd Barrett gets a nod on here once again with what is it, the song Eclipse, I think it is, where it's things, and if the band you're in starts playing different tunes. That's, you know, thinking about Dear Syd there. So once again, he gets mentioned. Yeah, Money being a single, Us and Them being a single, just, you know, whatever you want to say about this album. It's probably been said millions of times, but yeah. Fantastic thing, and the band's, you know, biggest selling album ever. So they move on there. You know, actually, I should mention that even like this thing here with Money, the sound effects at the beginning with the coins and the ripped paper, that goes back to their kind of household object sounds type of thing, which they now actually found use for. So the experiments with household objects would continue on for the next album, or at least it would inspire something for the next album. Rick Wright was experimenting with wine glasses filled up with different levels of water and, you know, running a wet finger around the rim. And they originally took those recordings and then put them together to try to make a chord, which then inspired the whole instrumental synthesizer beginnings for, of course, this one here, Wish You Were Here, and Shine On You Crazy Diamond. I heard that the wine glasses inspired it, which later on led to the actual keyboard composition, but I also heard that the actual wine glass recordings were used, and listening to this album again tonight, I thought I could hear a bit of a keening sound in places, you know, like where that actually could have been the actual wine glass recordings employed, perhaps. The idea was that they would have this one lengthy song, which they'd already been testing out live, called Shine On You Crazy Diamond, and then put a couple of songs in the middle of it, which turned out to be Welcome to the Machine and Have a Cigar, both Roger Waters songs heavily criticizing the music industry, which by this time, because of the band's success, Roger Waters was feeling more and more disillusioned by what was actually going on. And then, of course, the song Wish You Were Here also fit in there in that space between the two, in the gap between the two parts of the epic piece. You will find actually that whole Shine On You Crazy Diamond thing is basically ruled by Rick Wright. Of course, you get some guitar soloing by David Gilmour, you get the saxophone solo, and of course the lyrics, but for the most part that is Rick Wright playing synthesizers, different kinds of synthesizers, or some piano or other keyboards. So Rick Wright's contributions to the band, if you listen right from the beginning, let's say at least from Saucerful of Secrets, if not earlier, and up until this point here, he is responsible for a lot of the synthesizer effects, or organ, piano, all sorts of stuff. This guy, it seemed to just be very experimental and willing to cover just a whole range of things. You get other people like Rick Wakeman, John Lord, Keith Emerson. They were, you know, fantastic players who also did their fair share of experimentation, but Rick Wright seemed to be really interested in doing like atmospheric things, sound effect things, as well as, you know, more recognizable music. Interesting thing, during the recording sections for this, the song Shine On You Crazy Diamond was mostly a reference to Syd Barrett, you know, remember when you were young, you shone like the sun, shine on you crazy diamond, but it was also meant to be just about any young hopeful who starts out in the music industry with a head full of dreams and so many ideas, and basically finding themselves distanced from everyone and disillusioned by the whole thing later on down the road. And as they were recording this in the studio, one day this overweight guy with shaved head and shaved eyebrows came in, and at first nobody really knew who he was. They thought, oh, maybe he's somebody from EMI or something, and then I think it was Nick Mason who recognized, that's Syd Barrett. And Roger Waters, when he realized that was his childhood friend, it actually brought him to tears because of what had become of, you know, Syd Barrett. He hung around the studio for a bit, talked a bit, but didn't really seem to be, you know, there. And finally he just kind of snuck out again. There was actually a reception for David Gilmour, who had just gotten married on the same day, and during the reception Syd just kind of disappeared without saying goodbye to anybody. Wish You Were Here, anyway, not selling as well as Dark Side of the Moon, and receiving a bit of criticism from the critics for being not as interesting, but overall becoming the band's second biggest selling album, at least at the time, and also in retrospect being considered one of the great albums of not only Pink Floyd but rock music in general. Roy Harper doing a guest appearance on vocals, because during Have a Cigar, Roger Waters was not really happy with his vocal performance. David Gilmour refused to sing it, and so because Roy Harper was signed to EMI, he also came in and he provided the vocals for it then upon request. Roger Waters later on regretting that he didn't do it himself, but I think it's actually really good because the lines are spoken or sung from the perspective of a record company executive. And so in a way it kind of makes sense to have an outside voice doing that, and that, you know, it is the band Pink Floyd or whatever young hopeful band that is hearing this. So I think having Roy Harper do it is actually really good that way. So we're up to the 9th album, and what we see is quite interesting, because most of the bands we've taken a look at so far, by the time we reach the 9th album, we have founding members leaving, we have people suffering from alcohol or drug abuse, we have all sorts of problems going on, we have bands on the verge of collapse. Pink Floyd are riding it high, their 8th album being one of the biggest rock albums ever, their 9th album also being way up there. Success is coming to them, but the cracks are starting to show. Roger Waters is now recognizing that his songwriting and his ideas are what carries the band. In the studio, no more of them sitting around wondering, you know, waiting for their muses to speak or inspiration to strike. Roger Waters is now coming up with the concepts, coming up with the lyrics, and then they're working it out, fleshing things out live ahead of time or later on in the studio as well. Nick Mason going through a divorce and being kind of an uncomfortable person to be around in the studio, which kind of bothered David Gilmour. And Roger Waters kind of recognizing that because his ideas are what's leading the band, then he's gradually putting himself more and more in that position. That position of being a kind of band leader. And so that takes us up to the 10th album, Animals, released in 1977. This here already had some ideas in the works, Raving and Drooling, and another one which later on became tracks on this album. Animals, of course, being roughly based on the George Orwell story, what's it called? Animal Farm. But this time here, the animal characters representing figures in society, including pigs, which I believe are the politicians, dogs, which are the business folks, and sheep being the average, you know, Joe Blow type of thing here. I read in this book back here that Roger Waters actually split Pigs on the Wing in 2 parts, because having 2 tracks on the album would just give him, you know, royalties for 2 tracks instead of just 1. And that's what David Gilmour thought. You know, he had the 17-minute song Dogs, basically that was his creation, with of course Roger Waters doing the lyrics and most of the vocals. But, you know, Roger Waters would, you know, get extra royalties by splitting up his track there. But it is actually a really fantastic album, considering that, you know, this is a progressive rock album, a concept album coming out in 1977 with the punk rock thing going all around. I think it was Johnny Rotten famously having the Pink Floyd shirt where he wrote "I hate Overtop," which was basically done as a bit of a joke. I mean, they were after all EMI bandmates, right? Label mates, sorry, not bandmates, label mates. I personally think there's some really cool stuff on here. I especially like Pigs, 3 different ones, and Sheep, just because it's got a little bit more of a hard edge to it, especially Sheep, the conclusion, with a very exciting conclusion. But Dogs is also really interesting because it's, again, that lengthy Pink Floyd piece that goes from part to part very gradually. Really cool stuff here. But, you know, by this point, we're at the 10th album, and the tensions are really starting to appear. Roger Waters starting to get a little annoyed with Rick Wright, who, by the way, actually has no credit for anything on here, in spite of all the work that he did on the previous albums. An interesting thing, actually, with Pink Floyd albums, you know, we've got Syd Barrett doing the first one, we have Rick Wright all over the second one, we have David Gilmour doing all the vocals on the third one, and it just seems to keep changing from album to album, like who's doing more of the vocals, and Roger Waters starting to take over more and more vocal duties from here on in. This, of course, now would lead to several problems. Roger Waters, of course, getting very irritated with a fan at a concert in Montreal one time and spitting on him, which began the inspiration for the concept of the wall. We have Roger Waters getting more and more annoyed with Rick Wright and eventually firing him during the wall recordings. And Roger Waters also feeling more or less that, you know, Pink Floyd is maybe not so much his band, but basically treating it like his band, and like everybody else is just there to record the music for, you know, his songs and play out his concepts. So we see Pink Floyd very, very successful by their 10th album, but the tensions within the band are starting to appear. And that is my quick overview. I think it's already like 45 minutes or something. A lot of interesting little stories along the way, which I left out. Just otherwise, you know, this would have been a 2-hour video. But there you have Pink Floyd. Leave your comments in the comment section if you have anything you want to say about this. And otherwise, we're going to be coming back with one more band by the end of August, and hopefully 1 or 2 other videos in between. So thank you very much for watching this one. See you again in another video, everyone. Take care. And stay cool. It's a pretty freaking hot summer here in the Northern Hemisphere. All right, catch you in the next one.